as Ambassador Aho reminded us, it started before the reign of Louis XVI, who is, of course, a key figure in the story. It started in the time of Louis XV, at the end of the 7-Year War, which was a great humiliation for France and which led to the loss of huge territories, especially the loss of Canada. And in the 1770s, so during the reign of Louis XV, the government of Choiseul, of the Duc de Choiseul, tried to take advantage, as Ambassador Aho reminded, of the crisis of the Falkland Islands, of the Île Malouine, to break a war with Great Britain. But Louis XV was against that. Was it because of his character? He would decide to go for a war against Great Britain, or it was mainly because of the internal reforms that he was pushing ahead, especially the reform of the judiciary. And it was not only the reform of the judiciary, but also the fight with the parliament, which would eventually become a political power. And what was obviously the position of France, not to take part, not to help Spain in the Malouine issue, was not totally the truth, because at that time there was what we call the secret du roi, the secret diplomacy that was running its own route, parallel to the public diplomacy of the kingdom. And we know that in 1768, Choiseul sent Baron de Kalb to America to know the feelings of the American people, the situation of unrest in the British colonies. And Kalb, in his report, estimated les boutefeux auraient le dessous, and so that the Americans would be beaten by the British, but he had the feeling that London would be ready to make concessions. So even in 1768, and he noted le grand esprit d'indépendance et de licence dans tous les individus de ce pays. So the great spirit for freedom, for independence of anyone he met in America. And he knew that he had the feeling that that would lead to an independent state, an État indépendant. So in 1768, unlike what was the official position of France, there was this feeling started that there was something really important happening in America that could change the face of the world. And then it's with the new king, Louis XVI, that the political personnel changed, and that eventually Vergennes came into power. Vergennes as not the prime minister, though the function doesn't really exist in France, but at that time it was Maurepas, an old man, an old counselor to Louis XVI. But Vergennes was the Ministre des Affaires étrangères, and eventually he took a great importance within the ministry, within the court in Versailles in those crucial years. He was against the secret du roi, though he had been part of it, but he knew that a more open diplomacy should have to be played, especially against Great Britain, if things had to be to evolve. And that was not the position of everyone in France at that time, and especially as you can imagine, this new vision of helping the American insurgents was not shared by the Minister of Finance, the Contrôleur Général des Finances, Turgot, who eventually had to resign in May 1776. And it's in this crucial year that really the French government, the French court, started to build a policy towards the insurgents. But at the beginning, as Ambassador Aho also reminded us, the French were very afraid, or didn't know what to think about the American insurgents, about their strength, about their real position towards France. And that can be understood because, as you know, these very people that France was going to help in the coming years were the very ones that had been fighting the French in the middle of the century during the 7-Year War, and that led to the loss of Canada. And just to remind you this fact, remember the engraving that Benjamin Franklin published in 1754 of the American rattlesnake, showing the 13 provinces divided, and to show that if they were not united, they would lose. But in his mind of a good British subject of the time, his mind was not against London, but it was against Versailles and against the French people, the French troops in Canada. So really there is it's not an obvious story to have this link between France and the American insurgents. And the position of Louis XVI in that issue is very important. And first of all, he couldn't be happy to help a new regime that was going to be a Republican regime against a monarchy, one of the oldest monarchies in Europe, even though an enemy to France for several times, but still that was going against the established order all over Europe, and that was against his own throne. But nevertheless, there were other reasons to help the American insurgents. And so the revenge from the 7-Year War and the Treaty of Paris of 1763, but very wisely, the cabinet in France in those years didn't consider the revenge as a real military revenge or revenge to gain back what had been lost through the Treaty of Paris, especially Canada, but a revenge in a more global vision of a changing Europe. And very wisely, the idea was not to defeat Great Britain and to fight against her, and especially not to fight on its territory. That is to say, on the British Islands. And you know, there were quite a few tentatives to step foot on the British islands in the past century, and but this time the French were much wiser, and they considered fighting against Britain through the American insurgents, so that they could regain a balance of power in Europe, not to crash down Great Britain, but to gain power, and especially because the balance of power was changing in Europe, especially with the rise of new countries, new strong countries in Eastern Europe, that is to say Prussia, Russia, and Austria. From 1756, Austria was the new ally of France, and was not questioned to not help or not stay with this new ally, especially since the new queen was from the House of Habsburg. But that was not also to follow what was happening in Eastern Europe, and especially with the threats on Poland, and France was trying to protect Poland as much as possible. and more widely also the threats that Russia was putting on the Turkish empire in the Black Sea and through the Mediterranean Sea. So that's how the French government and Vergennes conceived the way they could step into this war. First of all, it was done secretly, and therefore, as you know, Beaumarchais was involved. Caron de Beaumarchais was involved in the first supply of helps to the American insurgents. Beaumarchais was from a family of clockmakers to the king. His father was one of the clockmakers to the king. And eventually he gave up that business, though he knew a lot about it. He was a mechanic in his own right. And especially in the musical world, he composed music and also improved the harp mechanisms. And through his contact with the banker Joseph Paris Duvernay in Paris, he started, he joined the world of finance and speculation, and that was his mainstream. But even though in 1759 he became the professor of harp for the daughters of Louis XV, and from that time onwards, he was included into the secret of the king, the secret du roi. So it's a strange position that this writer, musician, Beaumarchais. And Beaumarchais was allowed, but on the king's pressure, on the government's pressure, to create on the 2nd of May 1776 a company called Rodrigue Hortalez and Company with a Spanish name. And it's funny because that was the purpose was to join Spain in the financial effort to support the American insurgents. And in this company that was settled in an old townhouse in the Marais, France put £1 million, French pounds, and Spain put the same amount. So it was through Beaumarchais and the company, Rodrigue Hortalez and Company, that the first means were sent to America. And also ships were sent to help the Americans, 12 ships in Brest and 8 ships in Toulon. And the diplomacies started quite secretly with the Americans, and the position of Louis XVI is clearly expressed in one of his letters. He said on the 18th of October 1776, but first I would like to show you that the government was not involved. There was still peace with Great Britain in those years, 1706, in the year 1776, which is crucial. But with what was happening with Beaumarchais and others secretly, a member of the administration, Edme Jacques Genet, published, after the Declaration of Independence of July 1776, he published on the 16th of August 1776 the Declaration in extenso, in a newspaper called Affaires de l'Angleterre et de l'Amérique. And he says, he publishes, on m'apporte, monsieur, une traduction de l'acte du Congrès général de l'Amérique du 4 juillet. C'est sans contredit le plus grand événement de la campagne, de la guerre même, et peut-être de ce siècle. Je vais le transcrire ici en sa totalité, car il ne faut en rien perdre. De pareils écrits et des subversions d'empire sont choses très rares, heureusement. So such declarations are amazing because they are very subversive, but fortunately they are extremely rare. This is the official voice, in a way, of the government. So the government cannot say that the Declaration of Independence is a brilliant document and brings something totally new to the world. And that's why the last sentence is that subversion is very rarely happening. But it gives an idea to the French society that the French government, that Versailles, was supporting this declaration. And so Louis XVI, on the 18th of October 1776, wrote, Si nous sommes forcés de faire la guerre à l'Angleterre, il faut que cela soit pour la défense de nos possessions et l'abaissement de la puissance, non dans aucune idée d'agrandissement territorial pour nous, mais seulement en tâchant de ruiner leur commerce et de miner leur force en soutenant la révolte et la séparation des colonies. So really the vision of Louis XVI and of the government is to counterbalance the power of Great Britain and not to gain territory, but to ruin its growing commercial empire and try to get back to this trade in all over the world, actually. So through these documents, we know quite clearly what was the position of France, and that's why the Americans, the Secret Committee, sent in the American Secret Committee, which had started with the French monarchy since 1775 negotiations, secret negotiations, obviously, sent in March 1776 Silas Deane from the Congress to buy military equipment in Europe and especially in France. After the Declaration of Independence and the evolution of the position, it was more and more obvious that France would support the American insurgents. And a group of representatives were sent from the Congress, led by Benjamin Franklin, who arrived he was sent in October 1776, arrived in Paris in December 1776. And it's interesting to know how he was housed when he arrived, and eventually he stayed several years, as you know, in France. He was first housed in a hotel, in different hotels in Paris, the Hôtel d'Entragues, Rue de l'Université, and then the Hôtel d'Hambourg, Rue Jacob, so hotels for travelers. And eventually, in March 1777, he was housed freely by an entrepreneur with the East Indies called Jacques Donatien Le Rez-de-Chaumont in a wonderful hotel particulier on the outskirts of Paris in Passy, west of Paris. Nowadays it's included in Paris, but at that time it was not. And in this house that Le Rez-de-Chaumont had bought in 1776, and this is a beautiful house with 7 hectares gardens close to the royal chateau of La Muette. And first, Benjamin Franklin was housed in a small house in the domain, and eventually in 1779 moved to the main building, so really shared with the Le Rez-de-Chaumont family that beautiful townhouse. And eventually the Hôtel de Valentinois, it was its former owner, the Hôtel de Valentinois became the first American legation until 1787. But and other envoys came to Paris and joined Benjamin Franklin. So Silas Deane was already there, John Adams slightly later, and Arthur Lee as well. And they were not working with the French government openly still, and they had to meet in secret places, mostly in Paris or sometimes in Versailles, but not in the palace itself. We know that. And when the involvement of France became obvious, then they had official meetings with Vergennes in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Versailles itself. And as we were told, the French were a bit worried of these allies. Were their military strong enough against Great Britain? And after the victory of Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga, then France was reassured that they could go further to a war against Great Britain. And eventually, after seeing treaties with the American envoys in early 1778, finally, Louis XVI received Benjamin Franklin and the other envoys in Versailles, officially at an official audience on the 20th of March, 1778. And on the 22nd, it's the Queen and the other members of the royal family who gave audiences to the delegation. And the Duc de Croy, recalls this audience, and I'll try maybe not to read too much in French, but it's important because it gives really inside vision of something that had never happened before in Versailles. Audiences are very elaborate moments in the court life, and these Americans were going to break the rules. And so the Duc de Croix wrote, « Au lever, je trouvais à l'œil de bœuf le fameux Franklin avec les deux autres députés de l'Amérique, entouré de biens du monde, frappé de cet important spectacle. » So the envoys had to gather after discovering this amazing palace, I have to say, going through the Hall of Mirrors, entering the antichambre de l'œil de bœuf. They were waiting to be allowed to enter the king's bedroom, the king's bedchamber, where the audience was going to take place. So you have to imagine the contrast between what these Americans have been seen both in America and at the court in London, where Benjamin Franklin had been and a few others too, with the luxury of Versailles, of the court, and of the surroundings. And the Duc de Croix goes on. La figure pittoresque du beau vieillard, avec ses besicles et sa tête chauve, son air de patriarche et fondateur de la nation, jointe à sa célébrité comme inventeur de l'électricité, législateur des 13 provinces unies, et sa science, ajoutée encore à la beauté du tableau. And we know that what Benjamin Franklin, when he came to France, he didn't have to prove anything. He was already extremely famous. He had been to France twice before, and especially in 1767, he was presented to King Louis XV. So he knew Versailles, he knew the court, he knew how different it was from the court of St. James's and the life in America, what were the rules, and he was admired as a scientist, as a great scientist, and he was a member of different royal academies in France since the early 1770s. And with all that background, he came as a hero. But the hero of a new type of a nation, of a new regime, from a new continent that was not yet included so much in the social history of Europe. And that's why he decided to embody the spirit of the new nation, of the new country, in the spirit of the time of the Enlightenment, with the works of Rousseau on the bon sauvage and on the new values of simplicity against sophistication. And you know how sophisticated the court was. That was the role that Benjamin Franklin decided to play. And so he broke the rule by not wearing a proper French habit for the audience, with the proper sword and the proper hat he was supposed to wear, but just wore his plain brown coat with his very simple hat, which was not the tricorn shape that was compulsory at the court, but a round one. And that make the whole story, because people were, on one hand, horrified by seeing these so many rules broken by a person in front of the king, but on the other hand, they were excited. And some excitement won over the scandal. And it was a great success. Franklin was the popular figure in Versailles, in Paris, and in France at that time. That was not the case, I have to say, for his colleagues who tried, but not with the same capability, with the same intelligence, to play the role of coming from representatives from new nations, but they were not playing it so wisely. Let me take two examples. Arthur Lee, for example. He was maybe the one who should have been the most at ease in Versailles. He was from a very good family with strong links with Great Britain, with the court. He was speaking quite fluently French, so he should have been at ease there. But on the other hand, and maybe because of a Protestant background, he was so stiff and that he became hated by everyone in Versailles very soon. And you have to understand that within the American delegation, there was not, strangely enough, a sense of unity. There were dissensions between Benjamin Franklin, Arthur Lee, Silas Deane, and especially John Adams. So we'll see some examples of that dissensions and these fights within these envoys. And so obviously Arthur Lee was appalled by the way Franklin was behaving, but Franklin was right and Lee was wrong. And so he really failed to convince and to seduce the court. And for another character, John Adams, who was going to play a very important role in the following years, it's also the same. John Adams was maybe the strict Protestant of the group. And first of all, he was very jealous of Benjamin Franklin. He says on Benjamin Franklin, quote, "On Dr. Franklin, the eyes of all Europe are fixed as the most important character in American affairs in Europe. Neither Lee nor myself are looked upon of much consequence. The attention of the court seems most to Franklin, and no wonder. His long and great reputation, to which Lee's and mine are in their infancy, are enough to account for this." So there is a lot of resentment from John Adams towards Benjamin Franklin. And the other problem for Adams, that he was confused with the famous with Samuel Adams. And once people realized that they were not facing, in France, that they were not facing Samuel Adams, but John Adams, then he had to admit, and quote, "It being settled that but it's John Adams who speaks, it being settled that he was not the famous Adams, the consequence was plain. He was some man that nobody had ever heard of before, and therefore a man of no consequence, a cipher." And so we can understand why John Adams was not at ease at the French court with all these dramas that broke when he arrived. And so in a funny quote, he stresses once he was invited, he took part to what we call the Grand Couvert. It's another public ceremony that takes place 2 or 3 evenings a week where the king and the royal family, the king and the queen most of the time, but sometimes other members of the royal family, dine in public. It's in the queen's apartment in one of the big antechambers there. So it's a very important ceremony. Anyone can come until the room is full, of course. But then you have the king and the queen sitting at the table at one end of the room. Then in front of them, of the royal table, you have a seat of stools for the duchesses, who are the only ones who are allowed to sit for this ceremony. And otherwise, the nobility, the courtiers, and the visitors are standing in the room. And these dinners take place in music, and with a very important ceremonial. So John Adams were invited to this Grand Couvert, and he found any reasons not to like it. He doesn't mention the fact that this is a stupid or an awkward ceremony for him, but he said that he was forced to be standing on the first row after the duchesses, and saying, quote, the royal family had a fancy to see the raw American at their leisure. So that was his feeling. And he was not feeling at ease because he said, quote, my dress was a decent French dress, but not to be compared with gold and diamonds and embroidery about me. The eyes of all assembly were turned upon me, and I felt sufficiently humble and mortified, for I was not a proper object for the criticisms of such a company. I found myself gazed at as we, in America, used to gaze at the sachems who came to make speeches to us in Congress. So it's the way the story is returned for this American in Versailles, and how the links between the two countries were started with this excitement for the new insurgents, but especially through the figure of Benjamin Franklin and through the excitement of the nobility that went eventually to fight with the Americans in overseas. Thank you very much.